The crash came faster than anything he'd ever experienced in his life, or at least in the sanitized simulations the Space Academy liked to show their recruits. 1 second he was piloting with smug confidence, the next his ship was doing a chaotic pirouette through the iridescent clouds of a planet that seemed designed by a committee of prankster artists. The controls screamed at him, warning lights flashed like a disco gone horribly wrong, and somewhere deep in the bowels of the ship, something metallic groaned in a way that sounded suspiciously like it was filing for divorce. The hull hit the ground with a wet, squishy thud, bouncing slightly, then sliding along a trail of luminescent slime that had somehow covered the landing site. The explorer, as heroic as he imagined himself in the privacy of his own brain, managed to stumble out of the cockpit, tripping over his own boots and landing face first in the moss that glowed faintly, and hummed in what he assumed was mild disapproval. Before he could even register the pain in his arms and the small, probably broken, bone somewhere in his ribcage, movement flickered at the edge of his vision. A blur of vibrant colors, limbs bending at angles that seemed anatomically impossible, zipped toward him. She was small, barely half his height, but her presence had the kind of energy that could power a starship, or at least a small fleet of questionable appliances. Hair that shimmered in shifting tones of violet and green framed a face that was somewhere between mischievous and exasperated, and eyes so large and expressive it felt like she could see the entire universe in them. She stopped abruptly, one hand on her hip, glaring at him with what could only be described as impatient curiosity. "Pathetic," she announced. Not a question, not a greeting, just a statement of fact. The explorer tried to mutter something about extenuating circumstances, but only managed a wheeze that sounded more like a dying duck than a coherent defense. She didn't hesitate. From somewhere in the folds of her attire, or maybe summoned from thin air, she produced a device that looked like a cross between a medical scanner, a kazoo, and a lava lamp. It hummed, buzzed, and occasionally chirped, emitting bursts of soft neon light that danced over his battered form. "Wounds. Bad. Must fix." "No," she said, as though his opinion didn't matter in the slightest. Before he could argue, a bandage shot out of the device like a living ribbon, curling around his forearm with a gentle vibration that tickled and made him flinch. Another bandage zipped toward his shoulder, glowing bright enough to make him squint and sing out in alarm, which only earned a click of her tongue and a glance that suggested she was pondering whether humans were entirely hopeless. The healer moved with the precision of someone who had patched up hundreds of species, or maybe just herself, because she worked fast. A strip of glowing, vibrating material zipped across his torso, hums that somehow resonated with his heartbeat, causing the bruises he hadn't noticed yet to feel simultaneously soothed and slightly electrified. The explorer wriggled, trying to avoid what he assumed were shocking consequences, but every flinch just made her laugh, a sound like wind chimes being thrown into a blender. "You're supposed to stay still, human," she said. "Movement bad. Very bad. Heat sharing later. Now fix." She gestured vaguely to a pile of what looked like soft, slightly writhing blankets. He blinked. "Heat sharing?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, failing spectacularly. "Yes. Bed. Warm. Stabilize. Essential." She rolled her eyes, which for someone so small was impressively dramatic, and began hauling him, protesting, flailing, muttering about space safety protocols and personal boundaries, toward a low platform that wobbled under his weight. The bed, or whatever passed for one, was alive in subtle ways. The surface undulated slightly, the blankets seemed to pulse, and tiny lights blinked as if they were communicating a private joke he wasn't in on. He tried to regain his dignity, standing up straighter, only for the bed to shift unexpectedly, causing him to stumble face first into a pillow that emitted a faint musical note every time it compressed. She didn't even flinch. With a hand on her hip and an expression of mild incredulity, she adjusted the bandages and muttered, "Humans, fragile. But interesting." He wanted to respond, to say something clever like, "I'm more resilient than I look," but when he opened his mouth, all that came out was a strangled wheeze. Apparently, that was also very funny, because she laughed again, the sound bubbling and melodic in a way that made him almost forgive her for dragging him onto a reactive alien bed. The blankets enveloped him with an almost alarming enthusiasm, folding and rearranging themselves as if they had opinions about proper human positioning. His attempts at modesty, crossing arms, folding legs, were ignored entirely. "Stop resisting," she said, adjusting his position with gentle but firm hands that somehow managed not to crush him entirely. "Heat sharing. Very important. Warming now. Stabilize human. Survive night. No exceptions." He stared at her, trying to process this alien cultural imperative, the glowing patches on his wounds, the vibrating blankets, and the fact that he was being essentially kidnapped into a living nest of neon comfort. He gave up. Not because he agreed, not because he wanted to, but because every time he tried to escape, a floating orb shot out of the bed and gently, but insistently, nudged him back into place. He found himself lying there, tangled in glowing blankets, his pride slowly leaking out with every pulse of alien heat. Around him, the planet hummed with life, and the alien girl leaned back, clearly satisfied with her work. "Human, odd. Fragile. But we'll survive. Probably amusing too," he groaned, realizing that for the next several hours, or possibly days, he was at the mercy of this feisty, bizarrely competent alien healer, trapped in a bed that seemed almost alive, and that he would have to survive not just her medical whims, but the sheer absurdity of alien cultural norms. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that misinterpreting the phrase, heat sharing, might have been his first, and least intelligent, mistake on this very strange planet. The moment he thought he had a handle on the situation, reality decided to stage a revolt. Lying there on the pulsating bed, he tried to convince himself that maybe heat sharing wasn't as terrifying as it sounded. After all, it was just warmth, right? Simple, practical, maybe even medicinal in some alien sense. But as the blankets shifted beneath him, adjusting to his body automatically with a faint humming sound, he realized that simple was not a word in this universe's vocabulary. One blanket licked his arm with an almost sentient enthusiasm, and another seemed to tickle the back of his neck with tiny protrusions that glowed like fireflies. He jerked away reflexively, smacking the blanket, which caused it to shiver in protest. The alien girl, perched gracefully, or at least as gracefully as a multi-jointed, glow-limbed being could perch, watched him like an amused predator observing an overly nervous prey. "Relax," she instructed. "Resisting heat sharing is culturally insensitive. Very bad." He tried to respond, but every word came out garbled, tangled with sputters and exclamations that were entirely undignified. I mean, he choked, flailing an arm toward what he hoped was the blanket's off switch, but it recoiled like a startled cat. The alien girl clapped her hands in mild exasperation, and the blankets rearranged themselves with precision, trapping him in a glowing embrace. It wasn't long before he realized that resisting was hopeless. Every time he attempted to shift, a small, floating device, part mechanical, part organic, entirely judgmental, hovered nearby, nudging him back into place. He gave up and lay there stiff, glaring at the ceiling, imagining the hours stretching interminably. Then, of course, the ceiling responded, or maybe it was the walls, he wasn't sure anymore. Luminous panels rearranged themselves into shapes that seemed almost conversational, like they were whispering to one another about his foolishness. It was enough to make him sweat, glow-in-the-dark sweat, because the temperature controls of the bed were merciless. In the middle of this chaos, she decided to explain. "Humans fragile. Heat sharing essential for thermal stabilization. Survive cold. Live longer. Very smart custom. Very ancient custom. You lucky." He blinked, trying to process her words, but every syllable seemed to carry multiple layers of meaning, like alien poetry or instructions for assembling a death ray. He misinterpreted it immediately. "Lucky? You mean lucky like?" He gestured vaguely, not knowing how to phrase it without sounding like an idiot. She merely tilted her head, clearly enjoying the spectacle, then nodded solemnly. "Lucky. Very lucky." Then the blankets shifted again, reacting to some unknown command. The bed inflated in sections, forming what could only be described as miniature terraces, each glowing slightly different shades. The explorer's limbs were rearranged without consent. He ended up sprawled across multiple levels, one leg dangling into a vibrating patch that hummed ominously. A small, furry creature, also glowing, naturally, sauntered across the bed, curling up on his chest, adding weight and warmth he did not request. "This is survival!" she exclaimed, clapping her hands and causing the bed to pulse like a tiny heartbeat. "Very normal. Human adapt!" He swallowed hard, silently debating whether this qualified as torture or cultural exchange. The chaos wasn't limited to the bed. At one point, he attempted to shift to a more comfortable position, which triggered a nearby appliance, or was it a decorative object, to start spinning violently, flinging small orbs into the air. Each orb landed with a ping, emitting a note that sounded suspiciously like laughter. He tried to dodge them gracefully, which only resulted in a series of slips, trips, and a particularly spectacular tumble into a wall that wasn't quite solid, somehow bending under his weight like taffy. The alien girl barely raised an eyebrow. Human strength, impressive. Very inefficient. Just when he thought he might survive if he didn't move for the next century, the door, or the wall, he wasn't sure, opened, and other aliens arrived. They were smaller, more angular, and looked mildly offended to see him lying there like a soggy potato. The explorer froze, trying to explain himself, but words failed spectacularly. The aliens interpreted his flailing gestures as enthusiastic greeting rituals or some sort of mating display, and one of them even attempted to place a ceremonial crown, or what looked like a luminous jellyfish, on his head. He panicked, jerking violently, nearly knocking over the floating orbs again. The alien girl sighed, shaking her head with exaggerated exasperation. Humans. Fragile. Misunderstood. Must survive night. Very good at chaos. She flicked a small device that caused the orbs to settle, and the visiting aliens eventually left, muttering and gesturing among themselves. He exhaled in relief, only for her to lean close, whispering in a tone that was both casual and terrifying. Tomorrow, advanced heat sharing. Much fun! He groaned, realizing he had survived the first stage, only to discover the next phase promised even more absurdity. As he lay tangled in glowing blankets, furry creatures, and vibrating bands, he started to notice little things about her culture that were unexpectedly logical. Despite the chaos, there was method in her madness. The heating, the pulsing, even the floating orbs seemed designed to train, stabilize, and ultimately strengthen the human body in ways he would never have conceived. It was horrifying, exhausting, and strangely impressive. A small part of him, a very tiny, slightly masochistic part, admitted that surviving this bizarre ritual required human ingenuity. Maybe, just maybe, humanity had a shot at adapting to this alien world. He tried to move again and failed spectacularly. The blankets responded immediately, curling tighter, the pulsing intensifying. She clapped her hands in triumph. Good. Very good. Learning fast. Heat sharing complete, for now. He whimpered softly, realizing that the phrase, for now, meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. The blankets hummed, the glowing bands throbbed, and the furry creature blinked at him with eyes full of smug judgment. Somewhere deep inside, he accepted that this would be his life for the foreseeable future, trapped in a bed that was alive, under the supervision of a feisty alien girl who was utterly uninterested in his dignity, and constantly reminded that human adaptability was both impressive and utterly ridiculous. And yet, despite the humiliation, the vibrating blankets, and the glowing alien pets, he couldn't help but marvel at her efficiency. Somehow, amidst the chaos and absurdity, he was healing. Maybe humans weren't entirely helpless after all. But one thing was certain: heat sharing was only the beginning, and the next round promised even greater, farcical challenges. By the time the third cycle of heat sharing rolled around, he had long since abandoned any pretense of dignity. The bed had become a sprawling, multi-level contraption, each layer glowing with its own hue and humming in gentle protest at his presence. He tried to stretch out, hoping for a moment of relief, but the blankets had apparently developed an opinion on human posture. A strip of luminescent fabric slid over his leg like a living snake, wrapping him in a snug coil, and when he flailed, it recoiled with enough force to send him tumbling into a vibrating patch at the edge of the bed. He landed awkwardly, half on a small, furry creature that blinked at him with mild annoyance, half on a glowing pillow that sang a little tune of encouragement, or ridicule, he wasn't sure which. The alien girl perched nearby, eyes gleaming with delight, clearly enjoying the show. "Excellent progress," she announced, tapping a tiny device that caused another layer of the bed to inflate beneath him. He groaned, trying to calculate how many degrees of separation he could achieve without breaking alien etiquette or waking the sentient blankets. "Progress?" he wheezed. This is torture." She only tilted her head and made a sound that might have been a laugh, or maybe an alien equivalent of a sigh. "Torture? No. Fun. Very fun. Essential." He attempted to roll onto his side, which only resulted in a cascade of glowing orbs tumbling off the bed and bouncing around the room with obnoxious pinging noises. Each orb's descent was met with a tiny chirp that sounded suspiciously like laughter. One even landed on his shoulder, pulsing against his skin. "Stop that!" he shouted, attempting to brush it away, but the alien girl's hand shot out, gently pressing him back down. "No. Human must adapt. Very good. Learning fast." He flailed again, nearly launching himself into a floating lamp that hummed ominously, only to have the bed shift beneath him, corralling him like a neon, vibrating cage. She decided to escalate the therapy. From somewhere in the folds of her outfit, she produced what looked like a small, translucent ball filled with wriggling, bioluminescent goo. "Body massage," she said, bouncing it lightly. "Stimulates circulation. Very healthy." He stared in horror. "I do not consent!" he squeaked, but before he could react, the goo shot into his hands, squirming and tickling, glowing against his skin, and somehow pulsing in rhythm with the blankets beneath him. The alien girl giggled, a sound like wind chimes being tossed into a blender, and adjusted a floating orb that hovered above him, causing it to emit soft, encouraging pings at irregular intervals. Every attempt at human ingenuity resulted in more absurdity. He tried curling up to minimize contact with the blankets, only to find that the bed had shifted into a shallow slope, causing him to slide back toward the center. He tried reasoning with the alien girl. "Listen, in human culture," he began, only to be interrupted mid-sentence by the bed inflating again, nudging him into a different configuration that made him resemble some kind of glowing, vibrating human pretzel. "In my culture," she said calmly, "humans must embrace heat sharing fully. Resistance slows healing. Very bad." He groaned. Resistance had clearly failed. Adaptation was his only option. Somewhere along the line, smaller aliens began to appear. Not hostile, not exactly friendly, but curious. They clambered onto the bed, sniffed him, and one even attempted to drape a tiny glowing scarf around his neck. Each new addition increased the weight and the warmth, and he was soon stacked like an overstuffed sandwich between blankets, creatures, and the bed itself. His limbs tangled in ways that made him wonder if he'd ever regain full mobility, and every twitch caused the blankets and gadgets to react as if they were insulted. The alien girl, however, remained completely unflappable. She adjusted his posture, tapped devices, and occasionally whispered encouragements like, "Good. Very good. Adapt quickly. Human strong." He tried to resist, to argue, to somehow assert his human ingenuity, but every strategy only seemed to impress her more, which was mildly terrifying. He realized, with a sinking sort of awe, that she was teaching him survival, endurance, and patience all at once, using methods that were absolutely absurd and, frankly, impossible to get used to gracefully. At one point, he attempted a daring maneuver, a slow, careful roll meant to extricate his right leg from a particularly persistent blanket. The moment he shifted, the blanket responded like a living organism, wrapping tighter, sending him into a domino effect of sliding, bouncing, and rolling. He collided with a glowing pillow, landed on the furry creature, and ended with his face pressed into a patch of fabric that hummed indignantly. The alien girl clapped her hands in delight. Very good. Excellent reflexes. Human learning rapid. He groaned, muttering under his breath about how humans had not signed up for alien beds, vibrating blankets, or multi-species heat sharing. As the night, or what passed for night on a planet with glowing flora and pulsating skies, progressed, he found small victories. He learned to anticipate the bed's reactions, to balance himself against the vibrations, and even to navigate around the smaller creatures without incident. Each tiny success, though comically overshadowed by the absurdity of the situation, made him realize that human adaptability wasn't entirely useless. In fact, it was impressive, at least by alien standards. By the time the alien girl announced that the first major session of advanced heat sharing was complete, he was exhausted, tangled, sweaty, and glowing faintly from residual blanket emissions. He lay sprawled across the bed like a defeated, slightly traumatized hero, breathing heavily, but a small, stubborn part of him felt accomplished. Somehow, despite the chaos, the glowing goo, the levitating orbs, and the furry creatures, he had survived. Not with grace, not with style, but he had survived. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that the next session would be even more ridiculous, and he would have to adapt again, because humanity, apparently, never backed down from absurd challenges, no matter how neon, vibrating, or impossibly alien they were. By the time dawn, or whatever passed for dawn on a planet that seemed designed to prank space travelers, crept over the horizon, he was already in a state of resigned dread. The bed had expanded overnight into a sprawling, multi-tiered spectacle of glowing blankets, vibrating patches, and hovering orbs that now pulsed in coordinated rhythms. Every time he moved even slightly, the bed responded like a sentient creature, inflating, contracting, adjusting, humming, and occasionally letting out a soft, judgmental chirp. He had learned, the hard way, that human intuition was both necessary and utterly insufficient when navigating alien heat-sharing technology. The alien girl appeared almost silently, landing on the bed with feline precision. Her hair glimmered in the early light, eyes alight with that same mischievous intelligence that had made him question his survival skills the night before. She inspected him, tapping here, adjusting there, her movements precise and utterly unamused by his groans. "Ready?" she asked, tilting her head. He opened his mouth to protest, but a flick of her hand directed a small, hovering orb to press lightly against his temple, producing a mild, tingling warmth that made him squeak involuntarily. He sighed. Ready or not, it seemed he had no choice. The bed began to shift again, layers inflating like a bizarre cake that defied gravity and logic. The blankets glowed brighter, pulsing in rhythm with what he assumed was some alien version of his heartbeat. Small, furry creatures, already familiar from the previous night, climbed atop him, seeking their own share of the warmth. He tried to adjust, to reclaim some small portion of dignity, but each movement caused a cascade of effects. Orbs bounced, blankets shifted, and the creatures scrambled with alarmed squeaks that somehow translated into judgments on his coordination. The alien girl began her advanced techniques, which involved gentle but relentless manipulation of his limbs, pulses of vibrating light along the blankets, and the introduction of new tools that hummed and tickled. He was pressed, twisted, lifted, and gently bounced as if the bed itself were giving him a lesson in alien yoga combined with survival conditioning. At one point, he nearly lost his balance entirely, falling backward onto a particularly lively patch that inflated like a miniature trampoline. The creatures scattered, the blankets hissed, and the alien girl clapped in satisfaction. Excellent! Reflexes improving. Adaptation rapid. He groaned, muttering about how humans had not agreed to interspecies acrobatics. Trying to regain some control, he experimented with subtle movements, stretching one arm, wiggling a leg, and discovered that his human ingenuity could actually manipulate parts of the bed. A victorious grin almost crossed his face before a sudden vibration shot through the platform, tossing him lightly into a floating orb that hummed a cheerful tune. He collided with a glowing pillow that began to sing in what he could only describe as a mocking lullaby. The alien girl chuckled, a melodic, teasing sound. Good. Very good. Learning to predict is useful. Human strong. By now, he was covered in glowing blankets, vibrating bands, and furry creatures. The bed's movements had created a bizarre rhythm, and he found himself moving in sync almost unconsciously, a reluctant participant in an alien dance that combined heat-sharing, survival training, and slapstick torture. Each adjustment she made seemed designed to challenge him further, twisting him slightly to enhance warmth distribution, nudging him to maintain balance, introducing new orbs that floated just out of reach, testing his reflexes and patience. He tried to protest at every stage, but even his words were met with gentle nudges or the soft pulsing of blankets that encouraged compliance. Hours, or the alien equivalent of hours, passed, and he found himself strangely attuned to the chaos. He anticipated the movements, timed his reactions, and even managed to gently redirect some of the smaller creatures without upsetting the bed's delicate ecosystem. A small, stubborn part of him felt pride. He was surviving, adapting, and in his own way, thriving in this absurd, glowing, vibrating nightmare. The alien girl observed him carefully, a faint smile playing across her features. Human, remarkable. Strong. Adaptation, rapid. Very useful. Finally, she deemed the session complete. The bed settled, the blankets relaxed, and the orbs floated into neutral positions. The creatures curled around him, purring, or humming, or vibrating, or whatever it was they did, and the alien girl leaned back, surveying her handiwork with satisfaction. Heat sharing, complete. Human, improved. Very resilient. Not bad for fragile species. He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, entirely aware of how utterly ridiculous he must have looked, entangled in glowing blankets, vibrating bands, and multiple furry creatures, yet entirely alive and probably intact. He tried to sit up, only to have the bed gently nudge him back down, and he sighed, acknowledging that he had, for once, surrendered fully to alien customs. The alien girl patted him on the head, a gesture both tender and slightly condescending. Next time, you will not be so stiff, she said. He groaned, muttering, Humans never volunteer for alien beds. Despite the exhaustion, the humiliation, and the unending absurdity, a part of him felt victorious. He had survived. He had adapted. Humanity, even at its most awkward and flustered, had endured alien chaos with resilience, humor, and sheer determination. Somewhere deep inside, he realized that this ridiculous, glowing, vibrating, multi-species experience was a testament not just to the alien girl's ingenuity, but to the stubborn ingenuity of humans everywhere. As the beds slowly deflated and the creatures settled into comfortable positions, he closed his eyes, imagining a universe in which humans could navigate absurd alien cultures, survive improbable situations, and still come out alive, if not entirely unscathed, at least unbroken in spirit. And in the distance, the alien girl hummed a small, teasing melody, a reminder that the adventure, and the absurd heat-sharing, was far from over.